My name is Chaim Angel. I'm the National Scholar of the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, where we focus on, if you have to make a slogan for us, there's a longer slogan, which you can see on our website, jewishideas.org. We're all about the intellectual, spiritual experience of Judaism, trying to get a diversity of opinions and perspectives, because that's what Judaism is all about. One of the things which is probably the most boring topic I've ever come up with, of things that we need to talk about, is ethics. I mean, my goodness, what am I going to say? What is anybody going to say? Ethics are good. Okay, I hope we all agree with that one, and now we're done, and we can all go home. It's such a basic tenet of the Torah, and it's such a basic tenet of all of Jewish thought, that it's almost superfluous of a topic. You would just think that's what we live for, that's what our entire religious system is about, and yet, sometimes people like to say, you know, people these days X. So I'm a student of the prophets. That's what I spend much of my intellectual time doing. And when you read the prophets, you realize this isn't a modern day problem. This is an ancient problem where the prophets regularly decry people who served God in the temple, who kept Shabbat, who kept Kashrut, who did all the prayers, who did all the holidays meticulously. And yet, they were oppressing the downtrodden of the society. They were thieves. They were doing all kinds of terrible things. And the prophets decry that, and they say that God not only hates immorality, but God even hates the worship of God of those individuals. So it's not just a modern day issue, even if today there might be modern manifestations of it. And I think the root cause of it back then and now is the same problem, which is not enough people understand that being religious automatically means being moral. The Torah doesn't have the idea of a religious person who is immoral. But in our society, even among religious people, there's very much a gap between those two things. Easy exercise, even though with a setup like this I've already failed, but I'll do my best anyway. Imagine just the top 3 things, traits or actions that you would say define a religious Jew. Or ask children in school, what makes a holy person? How many of them are going to write, never cheats in taxes, is upright and honest, is whatever the opposite of obnoxious is, that. You know, somebody who's refined and wonderful and likable and totally filled with chesed, how many people will put that in one of the top 30 things that they would list for what it means to be a holy person? When you open up the Torah to Parashat Kedoshim, Kedoshim Tiyu, it totally mixes what we call of ritual law and ethical law, because the Torah understands that's what it means to be a holy person, and it tries to teach that. Sometimes people like to say, kids these days X. And that's true. Kids these days definitely have some work on their table. But often enough, it comes back to adults these days too. And again, it's not just these days. The Talmud already says that the speech of a child simply reflects the speech of the parent, or, you know, our apple not falling too far from the tree. If I may quote Rabbi Robinson, a sermon that he gave 6 or so years ago when I was living on the West Side. You'd think I wasn't paying attention and that I would forget? Wrong. Rabbi Robinson, besides being a tremendous Talmid Chacham and a genuine Baal Chesed and community leader of the first rank, is hilarious. And it truly has that great sense of humor, and the accent doesn't hurt. And all of those things were very memorable to me as a congregant here for a few years when I was living on the West Side in that capacity. Rabbi Robinson was addressing the issue that any synagogue has to address. There are lots of children running around, and the decorum, and that balancing act that any synagogue needs to address in terms of what balance they wish to reach. So Rabbi Robinson got up. I'll never be able to do your delivery. I apologize. And he said, I'd rather hear children talking in synagogue than adults talking in synagogue. And it was great. I thought that was such a great line. Everybody was waiting for something, or at least I was expecting a different second half of the sentence. But it really comes down to all of that. In our current issue of Conversations, which if you haven't already picked one up, please make sure you get one. It's the journal of our institute. It's really an excellent issue. There's a tremendous diversity of opinions, perspectives by very intelligent people of all different stripes. Rabbi Dr. Aaron Fried, who's really a leading educator in this whole realm, who cares about ethical development of Jewish students and communities, points out that it's not enough, not only do we need parents to set the tone, it's not enough to just have some curriculum in school where you learn about these things. You need to actually do and create a total environment where parents, teachers, administration, community are all together trying to develop these excellent people. And short of that, and short of the experiential, we're inevitably going to fail. He tells a very troubling anecdote of some yeshiva, I don't know which one, and I'm happy that I don't, where there was a black math teacher. And the kids would openly make racist comments in class to the point where the teacher would cry. And so one kid had a heart and soul within him and told his father about it, and his father got in touch with Rabbi Fried, which is how Rabbi Fried knows. And Rabbi Fried called the principal of the school and said, do you know what's going on? The teacher eventually left. He was so despondent over this horrible treatment, which is appalling. And the principal said, well, we don't condone this, we don't believe in this kind of thing, we don't encourage this sort of behavior. So Rabbi Fried asked, what did you do when the teacher reported this? Well, we tried to stop the problem, but we didn't really succeed. So Rabbi Fried asked, if a kid showed up to yeshiva in sneakers, how would you react? And would the kid show up tomorrow in sneakers because you failed? It matters how strong of a message you say of what's acceptable and what is unacceptable. And if we're coming anything short of that, we have a long, long way to go. And Mrs. Tzipora Shore, who teaches in a yeshiva day school in Baltimore, points out that very often schools celebrate intellectual achievement. Wow, what a great student, top-rate student, so smart, so diverse, great extracurricular activities. But how often do we put, what an honorably wonderful kid this person is, regardless of intellectual achievements, and why don't we say that that is the best? And until we're doing this across the communal board, we're not going to be able to build the kind of ideal society that hopefully we're trying to build and that the Torah demands of us and that the prophets are hoping and praying that we'll be able to do. That's why we have the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, started by my father, Rabbi Mark D. Angel, in 2007. The message, honestly, I always feel, I can't believe we have to say these things sometimes, and really the core of the Torah is so explicit and so beautiful and so worldly in every good way, and yet the community that we live in and communities 5 generations ago, and unless we really, really succeed as the Institute 5 generations from now, will have these issues that need to be addressed. And so that's what our job is, to keep our eye on the ball and to keep our community's eye on the ball. And we're very grateful to be able to run with members who support us and who really make this work possible. That's really how all of our successful programming, educational programming, our website, our publications, they're all because people care and realize our community needs to hear this message time and again and across the board. So I'll tell you, I want to pat myself on the back here. One thing that I really did great for this conference is I got 3 fantastic speakers. And you know, it was a tricky question in terms of thinking about who do you want to invite to talk about ethics in the Jewish community and what we can do on a practical level. And so I found the 3 greatest people around. I mean, they're really truly exceptional people. I mean, Rabbi David Jaffe, who's going to speak in just a moment, he believes in the hands-on, emotional, effective, practical, how do you transform one's personality? He published a book called Changing the World from Inside Out, which won the Jewish National Book Award. Not bad. And it's a good book. And it's something which is a very practical-minded, bringing from the best of Musar teaching, the best of Jewish rich religious ethical teaching from within. And he'll talk about his approach. He also has an article in our journal describing his approach on a practical level. We then have Dr. Shira Weiss, who has taught at Stern College for Women and also at the Frisch School, Jewish Philosophy. And she's our philosopher here. She's pursuing a postdoctorate degree right now in Ben Gurion University in Jewish philosophy. And she's published already a couple of astoundingly erudite books. And then we have Rabbi Daniel Feldman over here, who is a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, who is unbelievably prolific for somebody who also is a rabbi and who has a strong teaching load, but somehow he manages to publish not just books, but really learned books on Jewish ethics. They're all of them. One is on Lashon Hara, one is on Chesed, one is just in general being a good person within Judaism. He's also my rabbi, which is really fun. We moved to Teaneck a couple of years ago, and we moved right down the block from his synagogue, so I get to hear regularly talking on a very moving, intelligent way about how important it is to build our ethical community. And more importantly than the fact that all 3 of them are erudite and wonderful writers is that they're excellent people who live to their teachings. And that's really what makes it all work. People are very smart out there sometimes, but you don't really want to be their friend. Here we're really in the presence of 3 tremendously excellent people I consider friends myself. You know, God often demands faithfulness within the Torah, but there's one passage that we just need to have like emblazoned on our walls in all of our Jewish institutions. And it's in Sefer Devarim, where God doesn't want us to just keep the Torah because it's part of our eternal covenant with God, but God wants all nations of the world to see us and say, what a wise people and what a wonderful God to have such a just and moral system of laws. Rambam venerated that passage. He understood very well the universal teaching of the Torah, and that's really what we ultimately pray for, that all Jewish people of all backgrounds will understand the ethical centrality of just becoming an excellent top-rate person, and then projecting that goodness into the world so that ultimately we can bring the Messianic era that we all pray for, and hopefully we can even help do something about. Without further ado, I can go on because this is a very important topic that's very near and dear, but again, I have three wonderful speakers. I turn over the floor now to Rabbi David Jaffe. Not only am I turning over the floor, but I'm going to remember to give him this microphone thing, so hold on. Just a bit, it's just cover the tie. And
Thank you, Rabbi Angel. Does that sound good? All right. Rabbanim, Dr. Weiss. Kyle, it's a very big honor to be here, and again, topic that's very, very close to my heart. Rabbi Chaim Chernovitz, in his autobiography, he tells a story about growing up in the 1880s, 1890s in Europe, and he talks about in his town, the shuls were organized according to profession. And so there was a hat maker's shul, there was a shoemaker's shul, and there was a horse thief's shul. And he points out the story to say that there was an ethical problem in the community when you have a horse thief's shul. There's a gap there between all the ideals that Rabbi Angel was talking about in our Torah that we know, and then what you're actually doing in your life. That gap was something that I've always been drawn to and disturbed by greatly, even as a young child. Grew up in the New York area, and during an area of desegregation, and there was a lot of violence between black kids and white kids in the schools I was growing up in. And then the camp I went to, there was a lot of violence among the boys that were there, and I was always just shocked. And then in the background of this, learning about the Shoah and learning about slavery and other things, I was just, both on a personal, interpersonal level and on a big historic level, just shocked why people just couldn't behave better, you know, and why we couldn't follow the lessons that we were learning. This became really a focus of my work. Rabbi Angel mentioned the book I wrote. I'm an MSW. I've got my degree up at Columbia, up the street here, and I've got my smicha in Israel and Gush Etzion. And my work primarily is around Jewish ethics and applied Jewish ethics around Musar and teaching Musar. I do it in many different environments with organizational leaders, with people working for social change, with schools. I was the Mashgiach Ruchani, the spiritual advisor at a Jewish high school up in Waltham in Massachusetts, where I live now in the Boston area for many years. And I want to draw on that experience and what I want to say here. I'm going to speak very practically about a Musar being Applied Jewish Ethics program that I started at a high school. And I want to really go into that and into some of the details of that in a very practical way. And I'd like you to think about, as I'm talking, kind of what would this look like if we did something like this at my own institution? Or if I was going to apply some of these things in my own life? What would that mean? What would I have to face? What would we have to face? That's how I'd like you to listen to what I'm sharing with you. And I'll speak for about 20, 25 minutes, and then I'd like to open up and hear reactions you have about what would that be like? Would it work? Would it not work? That's the kind of thing. What I'm doing also is a very practical application of Rabbi Fried's article. If you just mentioned Rabbi Avram Fried's piece, he has a piece in this very fine edition of the journal. Our pieces are kind of like bookends in a way. He lays out a little more theoretical framework, and mine is how does this actually look if we do this in an institution? So I was working at a place called Gan Academy. It's a pluralistic Jewish school. It has kids from all different streams of Judaism in it. And we were facing a gap between our values and our behavior. We have just, have Jewish values of honesty, compassion, inclusivity. And, we had kids who were, it's basically a good school. So I don't want to say anything Lashon Hara about the school. It was a very good school, and the kids were great. And we had kids who were having trouble with academic integrity, which is a fancy way of saying cheating. We had kids who were involved in social isolation, a fancy word for bullying, and some of these other things, entitlement, things that are in all of our Jewish schools. So we wanted to figure out how are we going to bridge this gap and try to raise up the level of behavior. And as a student of Musar, I said, why don't we try something? Why don't we try a Musar program? And people were interested in diving into that. So first of all, what is Musar? I assume people here have either studied Musar or heard of Musar, but who here has, raise your hand if you feel like you've practiced Musar in your life? A little bit, which is one of the problems. Like, that's one of the issues. So Musar, what is it? It goes back to the Torah. Musar is really the stream of wisdom in Judaism about ethical behavior. And goes all the way back to the Torah, Kedoshim to you, as Rabbi Angel just mentioned, Pirkei Avot, a lot of different things. But we don't get any practical instruction in how do you actually become humble? How do you become trusting? How do you love God? In any practical way, really until the 10th and 11th centuries, with Rav Sadia and with Rabbi Ibn Pekuda in a book called Chovot HaLevavot, Duties of the Heart, which really a lot of people say is the first Musar Sefer, the first Musar book that has meditations and practical ideas and examples of how do you actually develop these character traits. That opened up or began a 1,000-year genre of literature that goes up till today, that is in every corner of the Jewish world, from Rambam in Rationalists of Spain to the Kabbalists of Spain, Rabbeinu Yonah, School of Nachmanides, to the Kabbalists of Sfat, to the Ramchal in Amsterdam and in Italy, into the 19th century, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and even all the way to today with Rav Dani Feldman writing Musar Sfarim. I would call them Musar Sfarim. You might deny it. So we have practical literature about how do we develop these traits and how do we make them real for us. Rav Yisrael Salanter in the 19th century, he was looking around at his own community and saw the same gaps that Rav Chaim Chernovitz saw, that we see in our communities between ethical behavior and our ritual behavior. He saw people keeping kashrut, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbos, but there was definitely an ethical lapse. And he was very concerned because as the Enlightenment was coming east from Western Europe and ideas of modernity around not just egalitarianism and other things, but also about high moral behavior was part of the Enlightenment ideals, he really thought that this were going to just sweep away Judaism in Eastern Europe if people did not really internalize their Judaism. Most people were kind of just going along with the community and very conformist. They said we have to really internalize Torah and these messages if we're going to really be able to stand up to the Enlightenment. And so he decided to create the Musar, what we call the modern Musar movement, or Musar movement, where he republished a whole bunch of these classic Sfarim that I just mentioned, and he created a program for how do you actually do this. And it was a program that was based on taking what we know in the head cognitively and bringing it into the heart. Because he said that, as Rabbi Angel mentioned, we can know all kinds of good ideas, like love your neighbor as yourself and don't steal and all these things, but we know that doesn't make a difference. And he was saying this will not make a difference until you can break through the heart. And he created a program that involved meditation, chanting, repetition of things, of teaching particularly the ethical parts of Torah, Choshen Mishpat, the part of civil law of Torah that he said really should be raised up and learned more. And he was an example himself of highly ethical behavior. And he created special houses, Batei Musar, where people would study this stuff in a very emotional, fervent way to be able to internalize these messages. This really took over and was took by storm in the Lithuanian yeshiva world and was really one of the only internal revolutions that really worked. And most yeshivot, or many Lithuanian yeshivot, started taking on Musar and studying Musar. The problem was, and we had special yeshivot that were really Musar yeshivot. The problem was after several generations, it kind of went back to the head again. And a lot of the practices and a lot of the really practical ways to bridge the head and the heart were left aside. So I know when I was in yeshiva, Musar for us was we'd open up Mesilat Yesharim and we'd study Mesilat Yesharim for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And that was Musar. That was not what Rav Yisrael had in mind. And he had something much more holistic in mind. And so that's what I want to talk about. So when we, again, wanted to try to do a Musar program, we wanted to really make it a more holistic type of program. There are 4 elements to the program that I want to talk about. And this I want you to think about as I'm saying it, how would this apply? The 4 elements were head-heart connection. 2, practice/habit. 3, accountability and inspiration. And 4, integrity. So I want to talk about those 4. And we really saw results. This program started, I think it was 2009. So we're actually about 10 years ago we started this program. And I would say after about 4 or 5 years, we really started seeing it in the culture. And we started from the beginning wanting to do culture change in the institution, which is a very important part of this, because we didn't want to just teach a Musar class, a Midot class, an ethics class. We did not want to just do that. We knew if we were going to make a difference, we had to speak to the whole institution. And after, I'd say, about 4 or 5 years, we had 75% of full-time faculty at the school had gone through a year of Musar practice. At this point in the school, we have about 25% of students. This is an opt-in program, volunteering to be in a VOD, a Musar VOD, a group studying for at least a year, every year. And the language of the Midot has permeated the school. Our head of school would integrate the language into his talks in front of the school. And teachers, department chairs, if they had a problem with a faculty member in a classroom, would be able to use the language of the Midot, of anava, of savlanut, of humility, of forbearance, and different language of Musar in their conversations as they were talking teacher to department chair. And students, I've heard themselves get up and speak about different Midot and how they wanted to really integrate those in their lives as they went out of school. So I would say that the program has done well, and we have gotten to where we need to be. Or, well, we have to keep growing, but it has, I don't know, infiltrated the wrong word, but kind of gotten into the culture. So these are the 4 components. Rabbi Eliyahu Lopian, one of the great Musar teachers, he says that what Musar is about is getting the heart to feel what the head knows. Rabbi Yisrael, I think it was him, was quoted as saying, the farthest distance in the world is from the head to the heart. So I think this is one of our problems, I think, particularly in the modern Orthodox world, and Reb Chaim already alluded to it, that we really valorize almost over everything else cognitive intellectual abilities, which I don't want to take anything away from. It's incredibly important that we have sharp minds and we can learn Gemara and you know, we're really strong cognitively. I feel like we have an over bias of that, of who gets honored in our community, as you just said, and because we don't change that way. I think everything we know about psychology and human development, we know we don't grow and change just through the mind. We just don't. And Rabbi Yisrael knew this 150 years ago. So what do we do for the head heart? Classic Musar, and barely anyone does this anymore. The classic Musar is a practice that Rabbi Yisrael developed called hispalus, or hitpa'alut, which was to learn a small piece of Torah, or a small piece of Musar, about an idea that your mind could really grasp. So let's say, Mavet b'chaim b'yad lashon. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. It's good practice. Say you want to, you're working on Lashon Hara. So you take that from Mishlei. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. And what he said is you study it. You're like, okay, death and life. Why death before life? Why the tongue? Why b'yad lashon? Why those exact words? You learn it like you learn any piece of Torah. Then, second step is you apply it to your life. And you try to get a really clear picture of how does this apply to my life right now. So I am embarrassed to say that I did once, this one time speak Lashon Hara. I've done it many, many times, but one time I did about a rabbi that was very important to me. And so when I was working with this phrase, I was picturing that rabbi and how much I love him and respect him, and that I spoke this Lashon Hara. So you get a really clear picture of how that applies to your life. That's step 2. Step 3, and this was the radical step that Rabbi Yisrael got in trouble for, was you chant it. You make it emotional. You evoke tears. You evoke sweating. You evoke, Mavet v'chayim b'yad lashon. Mavet, death, life, b'yad lashon. And you kind of go over and you repeat it and you sing it and you chant it. Rabbi Yisrael was quoted as having given drushes where he would stand in front of the kahal for 3 hours just saying a pasuk over and over again, and with great emotion, hislavus, great emotion and enthusiasm. So the other Rosh Yeshiva at the time said, this is for sick people. Like, what is this thing? This is like, this is not for normal people. And so he took it and he said, yes, we're all sick in a way, and we all need to open up our hearts. So that's why he created B'tei Musar, these Musar houses, so people could go do this practice on their own. It's a very powerful practice. I've done it. I've done it with other people. It was done for many years. Some of the great Musar figures from 100 years ago talk about how this changed their life doing this practice every day. You don't find it very much anymore. We did not feel at the high school that it was going to be appropriate for our students. We thought it would be too emotionally intense. So we didn't do it. But we needed to figure some way that we were going to open up the heart. And so we took the second step, and really work with that. The second step of taking the teaching and applying it to your life and really looking how the teaching applies to your life in relevance. So what we would do is we would study a particular midah, let's say anava or savlanut. We'd study the midah, and and then we would have the students really think through, okay, where is this showing up in my life? And then each student at one point during the year would be what we called the focus person. And we would have what we called a focus person protocol, which is like nice high school language, and you have protocols in high school. So what we do is the facilitator of the group, and I trained all these facilitators. They would work with me for a year. They would watch me run these groups, and then I would watch them run the groups, and then after a year they would take over and run the groups. So what the facilitator would do is they'd sit with the student and they'd really talk through with them in their life. Like, okay, how does kavod show up in your life? What are you seeing about honor, respect? Where's that really real for you? And what's a question you could ask our group when we come and meet with our group again? These groups are about 10 to 15 people. When you meet with the group, present them with a question about this trait, about kavod, and how that's showing up in your life. And they can ask you questions to help you think about it. And so we would prep the person on that. We think through, and then it would be time for the person to come. They come and they present. And it was very moving to be in a room. And these groups, I tell you, they were a mix. Some were all student groups. Some were all faculty groups. And then some were the most popular were student-teacher groups, actually together, where teenagers and adults would be working on these midot together. And it was very powerful. And obviously the teachers had to have boundaries around what they would talk about, but you'd be surprised. The kids were really open about what they talked about. So for example, I remember this really stuck with me many years ago. We were doing kavod, and this 17-year-old girl was presenting, and she was talking about kavod in her family, in kibud av v'em, for her parents. And she was talking about how her parents had all these expectations on her, academic expectations for her. And she felt like the challenge for her was if she fulfilled those expectations, it wasn't really kibud av v'em, because she was just doing out of obligation for them what they wanted to do, which in a way, like technically, halachically might be, but she felt that wasn't really kavod. She was struggling to find some other way that she can honor them that might have been outside of their expectations for her, that they might not expect. And I'm just telling you the story to show this was very real for her, and this is how she was analyzing and understanding kavod in her life. And as an adult, it was an amazing opportunity to hear a teenager talk about how they understand their relationship with their parents. Incredible. But that was the kind of thing we would do. And students would really think in their lives, how does this apply? And that was the way we would get at the heart and try and open the heart for them to make these midot really real, not just ideas. The second area is practice and habit. Practice is the language of the heart. I'll say it again. Practice is the language of the heart. When we do things, na'aseh v'nishma, we actually do, and then we come to understand. And so in Musar, there's something called the Kabbalah, not the mystical Kabbalah, but the Kabbalah being something you take on yourself as a challenge, a small challenge you give yourself for the midah. And you practice that. And the purpose of the Kabbalah is to shake you out of unconsciousness. So you're actually doing something, so it brings ideas and things from your unconscious to your conscious awareness, and can create habit over time. And habituation is incredibly important. So just like an athlete is going to practice, like a batter, right? You're going to go to the batting cage and swing, take 100 swings, 1,000 swings. And professional athletes talk about that they're only able to do what they're able to do because they've been practicing over and over. It's muscle memory. They don't need to think about it. We need to create muscle memory about good midot. And so that could be, Rabbi Fried talks about in his article, chesed programs, different things like that. You want to create that kind of muscle memory for behavior. So what it looks like in a Musar practice, and we did in our school, so say we're doing anava, so humility. Idea of humility is being right-sized. It's not just being small and meek, but sometimes you have to step up and take more space. It depends on who you are in the continuum. But anava is taking the right amount of space in any situation. So we have a student who feels very comfortable taking lots of space in class, in history class. So his Kabbalah was, you're going to listen to 3 people before you say anything in this class. And then you're going to let 3 more people speak before you speak a second time. And if anyone's taught in high school or been in high schools, you know those kids. Their hands are always up. They're always speaking. And so this was this guy's Kabbalah. And so every day in history class, he was going to practice his Kabbalah and hold off and not speak, and do that for a month to come back to class. That's how you create muscle memory of something, and that's how something gets in. And then you write about it. You do cheshbon nefesh. You journal about it after. Of like, what did that feel like for me to listen to those idiots speak before I could speak and speak? And like, how was that? And over time, these things you shake it up a little bit. I'm not saying this guy totally changed, but you do shake it up a little bit. Rav Yisrael said that it's harder to change one midah than to learn the whole Gemara, learn the whole Talmud. And so if we can change, really think about it, if we can change just 1%, in 10 years, instead of being here, we're way over here. So that's what we try to do. We try to do these little changes. And so that's how we would practice. As an example of it. Good, so that's practice and habit. The third component of the program is accountability and inspiration. And this comes from the Chevra. So this is not a solitary, isolated practice that you do by yourself. It's a practice you do with a group. You can practice Musar on your own. You can. People have. But it's way more effective if you do this in a group. And you have to have accountability. So for this guy in the history class to do it, it's very easy just to be like, yeah, I'm going to do this, and then not do it at all. We know, and Weight Watchers knows this, like any behavioral change program knows that you need to have accountability to people to keep up with the behavioral change. Alcoholics Anonymous knows this. You have to show up and you have to say, this is what I'm going to do, and then you know you're going to see those people the next week, and you're going to say, did I do it or not? And so that's the way we call vadim. That's the way these vads are set up. You take on a practice, you say, I'm going to be the third person to speak in history class, and then you show up and be like, well, were you? How'd it go? And we assume the person's truthful, and they'll talk about what they did. Oh yeah, I forgot it a bunch of times, I did it a couple of times, but they know they're going to show up and have to actually say what they did. Now, the Musar that I teach and that I learned is kind of a kindler, gentler Musar. The kind of classic old school was you would be in this Vad and you would show up, you're working on humility, you would say how you thought you did with humility, and then everyone in the group would go around and tell you how bad you were at humility and how much you messed up in humility. And that was kind of how it used to work in the Vadim that I've heard from teachers of mine who were in those Vadim. That's not the way I learned it. When I learned Musar, Rav Shlomo Volbe was the person that I was blessed to hear from first. Then his students, it's a more positive, more kind of build up people type of approach. So the way that we did it at the school was you had these accountability groups, but you didn't give people a hard time. You just said what you did, and then you asked them questions like, well, what happened? Why didn't you do it? You didn't kind of give it to them. We didn't do that approach. That might work in some circles. I don't think it would work in our school. And then the second thing is, and you have a chavruta every week that you're checking in, saying, did I do it? Did I not do it? That's accountability. And then finally, the other piece is inspiration. This is an idea really more from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, not from the Musar movement, about how we inspire each other. So Rabbi Nachman said that you should do 3 things every day. You should do hisbodedus, meaning talk to God, have a conversation between you and God. You should learn Shulchan Aruch every day, and you should have a sichas chaverim, which meant a discussion with a friend about spiritual matters. Every day, you should talk to a friend about spiritual life. The purpose being that we inspire each other when we hear about spiritual life. Or maybe we get a little jealous. And it's, kinat zofrim. It's like a jealousy between scholars inspires us to do more. Here, wow, you did Hippolytus 5 times. You talked to Hashem for 20 minutes a day. Man, I'm a schlub. I'd like to do that. That's amazing. And so you get inspired. So that's the second thing we would do in these accountability partnerships. We talk about what people are working on that then give people something to reach for, stretch for. So that's the third piece, accountability. So far we have head to the heart, we have practice and habituation, and we have accountability and inspiration. The fourth piece, and this is essential, was integrity. What do I mean by that? I meant organizational, institutional integrity. That, again, we weren't starting a midot class for kids. And we said to the kids, you should behave this way and practice these midot. We said this whole institution is doing it. So we started with the faculty. We didn't have students come into this program until year 3. We did the first 2 years just with faculty, and they were in their own vadim doing everything that I just told you. And so by the time we got to the kids, they saw that, well, the teachers do this. And so when they knew their history teacher was practicing bitachon, trust, and oh, that's what I'm doing in my VOD too, you can imagine what a difference that makes to them. They say, oh, wait, oh, you really actually take this seriously. Like, you guys are really doing this. And then not only do we have the faculty doing it, we also had the management doing it. And so we had the leadership team, the head of school, CFO, all the leaders of the school also practiced for 2 years together. So it was at every level of the school. We didn't have parents, which would be another level. But the high school, parents honestly are less important. It was at an elementary or middle, I would say maybe do it differently. But for us, so we had all those levels practicing. So that was one level of integrity. Then, and I told you, 75% of teachers in the school, and it's probably up from that now, are actually practicing Musar. The last piece was on integrity was we created something called an ethical contractor policy. It became aware to some of us at the school that our janitors who were on a contract policy, not full-time employees of the school, were being ripped off by their employer, by their contractor. They weren't getting the health benefits they were supposed to get. They weren't getting vacation and sick pay and all that. And so we talked about what should we do as a school, and we decided that we needed to create our own policy that would govern outside contracts. And so we created an ethical contractor policy. And what this policy was we said, okay, fair wages, safety, training, all these kind of things that any outside contractor needed to do. And we actually had a bid process for contractors, and we would ask them, what do you pay your workers? And some of them didn't even know what they paid their workers. They're like, well, why do you care? We're just going to give you the lowest bid. And I said, no, it actually matters to us what you pay your workers. And we ended up going with a contractor that was going with the prevailing wage. And that became part of the school, was an ethical contractor policy. We then had to work on our landscaper contract. So we had students come in, and students then research the field of landscaping in Massachusetts to find out what prevailing wage was, what work conditions were like, and all that. So we then could set standards for an ethical contractor policy. And the importance of this was that students saw that, oh, we're talking about these qualities of treating people fairly and kavod for your workers. We're actually doing it. And the schools are actually taking this seriously, and they're walking the talk. That kind of thing for teenagers is essential because they're looking for any gap that they can find, and hypocrisy that they can find between what the adults are telling them and what they're doing. And they're going to point that out, and they're going to take that hypocrisy as an excuse to not have to really follow through on these commitments. So the institution needs to have that kind of level of integrity for this really to be have the power to change people. So those were the main things we did. Those 4 things: integrity, accountability, inspiration, head, heart, and practice and habituation. I did this at a school. I think you could do this at other institutions. I think we could do this at shuls. I think we could do this at Jewish community organizations. A lot of my work now is with chairs of board chairs of Jewish organizations and their CEOs on learning this material. We're not yet doing as comprehensive an approach as I told you, but I'm doing a first step, trying to get them to appreciate this wisdom. But I think shuls also, shul boards, that could also be a good place to do these. 2 caveats if you're thinking about doing something like this before I stop and take questions. One is the opt-in piece is very important. To do this work at a deep level, you are asking people to open up and to really talk about their personal lives. And it just doesn't work well when you force that. I see this with my own kids. They're in a lot of, they're high school kids now, and they're in a lot of kind of programs that want them to share personally. And they just make stuff up. You know, they kind of like know what the teachers want to hear, so they just make it up. And I asked them, I was like, do you really believe that? They're like, no, of course not. Like, it's kind of like, well, what do you really believe? So I think the opt-in is key. And that's challenging because sometimes we get excited about this. We're like, this is awesome. Everyone should learn these midot. Let's make everyone do it. That's okay if you're going to learn it on a cognitive level. But if you're going to start going to the affective heart level, especially at a high school and older, the opt-in voluntary nature is important. So I'm saying it's a challenge. I'm not saying you can't do it. Everyone, I've done it with boards of directors, and it's not opt-in. They all need to do it, and it's trickier. It's trickier, and I'm happy to talk to anyone, offline about how to do that. So that's 1. 2 is really to avoid superficiality and a quick fix, because the quick fix is let's do a Musar class, and that's okay. but know it's going to be really limited in its effect if you're not going to try to do something more broad. So maybe it's a step on a way to something broader. But really try to think about that of how are you going to try to hit all these different pieces, because if we just deal on the cognitive level, it's really not going to do it. So I'll end in just summary those four aspects, that what we're trying to do is, in the words of the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, we want to make the words of Torah go on fire. We want them to have light. They have light, but it's like they're a coal, an ember that's barely burning. It's kind of burning a little bit, but they need to be blown on to really light up. And the blowing on them is how we work with these ideas, how we bring them into our life, how we live them, how we bring them to our heart and our actions. That gives Torah light. So that's one of the things we can do here, is bring more light and light up the Torah. And the other, finally, is, or Yisrael Salanter says, is that for a Talmid Chacham, there can't be a difference between their actions and what's on the inside, what's on the outside. Tochel Kaboro. It needs to be all integrated. What we teach in Torah needs to be totally integrated into ourselves. We become walking Sifrei Torah. So, God willing, with this approach, people really integrate, and we end up making Torah alive both in itself and also in ourselves. So I want to wrap that up for the formal talk, but I really would like to hear from you about if you really thought about applying some of these ideas. Think it would work? Think it wouldn't work? What some challenges might be for you? So yeah, go ahead. The question was, how do we get people to opt in? So we started off with a steering committee that was made up of students, administration, faculty, and parents. The students were very clear when we were starting the program: do not make this a school-wide Midot program. Don't roll it out like that. Start with a small group of students and make it really exclusive, and make announcements about it, but it's really exclusive. And so the other students are going to be curious. What is that thing? Wait, why am I not in that? So kind of play with that kind of, the little Yetzer Hara a little bit there, of like wanting to be in something special, and go with that. And that's how we started, and it worked. And so we started with the one group, then second group, fourth, fifth group, and then it became, the thing was called Chanoch Chanar, or CLN. And so they would hear these announcements over and over again. Kids would hear about it, and it kept building up. And so by this year right now, we have 25% of the student body opting in to these Vadim. Yeah, so, but it took time. Yeah.
How do you measure effectiveness?
Yeah, so that's it, right. How do I measure effectiveness is the question, and it's a really, really important question. So we did a few things. We had funding from the Avichai Foundation, first from Covenant and then the Avichai Foundation for it. And Avichai hired an evaluator. So we actually got to have a real professional evaluator come and look at the program. And what we looked at was, we looked at both process, like were people doing the things that they said they would do, and then were attitudes and actions, attitudes and behaviors changed in any way. And we looked at both of those things, and we definitely saw positive results, that yes, people were doing the stuff for the most part, and attitudinal change was big, and some behavioral change was definitely lower, but it was happening. And I'd say the trickiest thing to measure for us was attitude towards Judaism, because that was one of the things we were hoping too, was this making Judaism more relevant to you in your life? And that was it was hard to measure that piece, because it's kind of a long-term proposition that I make with this, that if students can see the Jewish categories of these midot, which are also universal categories, a lot of them, but we teach them from a Torah place, if they could see these have value in their life, over time it'll be one more data point of why Torah is important to my life. But it's hard to measure that in the short term. So that was how we measured. But it's an important question, and it's hard to do, and we had the benefit of an evaluator. I see a few hands, so we'll go, yeah.
Yes. So what can you say about a yeshiva whose students feel free to stone Palestinian cars passing and ultimately kill an innocent woman?
Yeah, I think they need a really serious Musar program. No, I'm serious. I don't mean...
Students didn't get their attitude from nowhere. And if they were yeshiva students, they were in a school setting where there was an atmosphere.
Right. No, I agree. I think it's a very serious issue. And, I think that this type of moral behavior is the most important thing in Judaism. That's why I spend my time focusing on it. And so I think at every level, we need to be making sure that we are holding ourselves to that kind of standard. So I don't know whoever oversees the yeshivot, what's going on there, and who the Rosh Yeshiva are, and what's being taught there, and what kind of, again, some of these things, it's very complex. Some of these things could be happening in a shir that's off to the side, and there could be one Rav who's kind of teaching a certain kind of thing. It's not the mainstream thing in the yeshiva. But still, just like the racist story that we heard before, there needs to be oversight of that kind of thing. And if things are out of line with our highest moral behavior, I think we need to make very strong boundaries there and just raise this up. So I'm just going to end with, again, a thank you for being here. I'm going to do something that's very un-Musar Dick and Menchie, is that actually I need to leave. I'm having another appointment I have to go to, so I'm going to go to the back and hear a little bit of the next year, but unfortunately I have to go. But it's been wonderful being with you. If there's personal, you want to ask anything specific about this program, I'm happy to talk to you one-on-one, and my email is easy to get to me, rabbidavidjaffe.com. You can find me online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Angel, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. My discussion this morning is going to be of a very different nature than we just heard, far less practical, and it really stems from my academic research. And a lot of my research that focuses on philosophical analysis of Tanakh was motivated by my own challenges when studying Tanakh. As a young student of Tanakh, and even as a more mature student of Tanakh, I found myself often quite bothered by a lot of narratives that were problematic or presented different moral challenges to my sense of ethics and my moral conscience. And so I began to use philosophy to try to elucidate some of these challenging texts in Tanakh. And I feel that there's a really mutually beneficial relationship between philosophy and Tanakh. On the one hand, philosophy benefits Tanakh because it allows us to decipher a lot of ambiguities in Tanakh. It allows us to universalize a lot of particulars within Tanakh. But we also see that the Tanakh really benefits philosophy, specifically moral philosophy or ethics, because using moral philosophy and subjecting biblical narratives to moral philosophical analysis allows us to kind of concretize a lot of the abstraction of philosophy. And that enables us to better understand what ethics is trying to teach. And so I feel that through the ethical analysis of Tanakh, I've gained a better understanding both of my study of Tanakh as well as my study of philosophy or moral philosophy in this instance. And through my teaching, both in the high school and in the college environments, I've found that my students have been particularly receptive to this and appreciative of this. Instead of kind of either skipping over entirely or glossing over a lot of problematic or challenging biblical texts, by really engaging in a philosophical analysis, it enables them to take familiar stories that perhaps bother them initially when learning and give them a new perspective or even multiple perspectives to view the particular episodes that are depicted in Tanakh. And I think that there's a real need in moral education for students to be conscious of the complexity or the varied perspectives that are inherent in moral conflict, and allow this tension to inform students' moral perspectives and their evaluation of dilemmas that they could encounter in their modern lives. Now, the Tanakh illustrates moral complexity in many of its narratives, and it serves as an important resource to guide one's ethical practice and thinking. And as Rabbi Angel mentioned in his introduction, the Torah very much is a book of ethics, but moral lessons are not always explicit or clear in all of its episodes. And there are various episodes throughout Tanakh that elicit significant ethical questions. For example, how can one make sense of divine commands that seem to contradict our perception of morality? Should one defer to God's command, or should one follow one's own moral conscience? How is one to conceive of and how is one to respond to that which seems to conflict with divine justice, one of the largest problems in moral philosophy is the problem of evil and the suffering of the righteous. Also, is it ever appropriate, is it ever ethical to lie or deceive? And if so, under what circumstances? Is it ethical to lie or deceive in order to fulfill a commandment, in order to fulfill a divine prophecy, in order to save someone's life? Essentially, all of these questions ask, how can human ethical practices be maintained when one really needs to choose between competing values when encountering dilemmas in which morality seems to be challenged? Example of these narratives in Tanakh are, for one, Akedat Yitzchak, God's command to slaughter Avram's son, the divine command to annihilate Amalek for all of eternity, the plight of innocent Eov in the book of Job, and many cases of lying and deception by biblical characters. All of these raise ethical issues and really need to be scrutinized from a moral perspective. And while commentators can suggest interpretations which either assuage or circumvent some moral problems, the conflict that's inherent in the text really needs to be examined if we want to raise awareness of the challenges, if we want to ask thought-provoking questions, if we want to help students realize that there's not necessarily one overarching rule that can deal or can respond to every scenario, but rather we want to give students the tools that can help them navigate ethical dilemmas. And exposing the students to complex moral issues from within the traditional sources, that can help contribute to a thoughtful morality that they can develop as they emerge as more mature ethical identities. Now, ethics in Tanakh is generally perceived as a list of biblical commands, moral commands imposed by God, and for which man or woman is rewarded or punished. But many ethical issues are not addressed in biblical laws and are rather inherent in moral life and are depicted in the stories, not the laws in Tanakh. And these narratives comprise an important source of moral guidance, and they portray ethical ideas in very dramatic and in very personal ways that the reader of Tanakh can really identify with. Now, unlike explicit laws like in Nasser Zibrot, lo tirtzach, you shouldn't murder, lo tignov, you shouldn't steal, it's difficult to decipher the moral lessons in many of the biblical stories because there's no authoritative judgment of the behavior of the characters that's explicit in the text. Often characters, even when they're involved in episodes that a reader might perceive as ethically ambiguous or ethically challenging, it's rare that the Torah actually judges or condemns or even praises the particular conduct by the biblical figure. Now, the Tanakh's moral vision is not one singular viewpoint that is conveyed uniformly by all of its different narratives, but rather the biblical stories contribute to a wide-ranging sense of morality, and that sense of morality can also include conflicting positions on ethical issues. So the Tanakh really illustrates moral questions through its narrative, and that illustration inspires reflection upon ethics, but it doesn't necessarily always say, this is the ethical dogma, this is the ethical act that one must pursue. Now, the ambiguity, therefore, of many of these episodes is really left open to diverse and sometimes even paradoxical interpretations by commentators and by students of the Tanakh, just as the conflicting interpretations that many encounter in evaluating moral dilemmas in modern life. Now, an analysis of the motivations and the behavior of biblical characters in ethically challenging predicaments can really help students think through the difficult personal dimension of ethical problems and recognize the competing tensions and the multifaceted aspects of ethical conflicts. Students can grapple with the complex ethical questions that are elicited by these episodes, and they can internalize the tensions and the various perspectives into their own moral thinking. And when they examine the conduct of these biblical figures, and they have sensitivity to the inner tension that influenced the actions, that can contribute to the student's own moral reflection when they're faced with their own ethical debates in their lives, because one can assess someone else's complex predicament with a sense of kind of detachment and without prejudices that may arise when evaluating oneself. And when the students find personal meaning in their assessment of the challenging episodes described in the Tanakh, they can also not only internalize those things that they connect with from the Tanakh, but they can also learn from the lessons, even if they haven't undergone such an ordeal, by understanding and appreciating the tensions and the various motivations of the biblical characters and the inherent nature of the competing values inherent in moral debate. So let's discuss some of the examples from biblical narratives which elicit ethical questions that need to be addressed when teaching Tanakh or philosophy. Such episodes often challenge students' moral conscience, and I think that needs to be broached. And I found in my classes, my students appreciate when it's broached in a very sensitive and also honest manner. For instance, God's command to Abraham to slaughter his beloved son in Akedat Yitzchak in Breshit, Parakaf Bet, the divine imperative to annihilate the entire nation of Amalek for all of eternity in Dvarim, Parakaf He, the suffering of the righteous depicted in the plight of innocent Eov, and the many cases of deception throughout the Tanakh, all of these examples raise difficult ethical questions that can be subjected to moral analysis. Some of these questions include, for instance, in the Akedah, the question of divine command morality. In philosophy, the question of divine command morality essentially asks, does God dictate morality, or does an independent ethical standard exist? Was the divine imperative that God commanded Abraham to offer his son Yitzchak as a sacrifice, is that to be deemed moral simply because God commanded it? That's what divine command moralists argue. Could or would God command that which is immoral? Is God subject to an independent standard of morality? And if so, what are the implications regarding God's omnipotence, God's all-powerfulness? If he was subject to an outside standard, does that detract from God's power? The second example that I raised, Amalek, the commandment to annihilate all of Amalek for all of eternity. That also elicits ethical problems. What was Amalek's evil deed that warranted such a severe punishment? Wouldn't you say that the killing of women and children and later generations of Amalek, wouldn't you say that that seems immoral? Now, even if we can understand that God's command to annihilate the nation of Amalek that was described in the Tanakh, even if we can say that that may be justified because, after all, the nation of Amalek violated the norms of just warfare, they attacked the Nechashalim, the enfeebled from behind, they didn't play fair, even if you can say that that was a just retribution for that generation described in Yetziat Mitzrayim, what about the eternal nature of the imperative? How can we understand from an ethical perspective that the Amalek descendants need to be destroyed for all of eternity? That does seem far less justifiable. The third example that I raised, Sefer Iyov, similarly raises questions with regard to divine justice. Does the divine will dictate what is just and what is not just? Or is God subject to some external standards of justice similar to the divine command morality I raised with regard to Akedat Yitzchak? Now, throughout the Tanakh, God is characterized as a just deity. Tzedek u'mishpat, God employs justice and righteousness. God exacts fair retribution by rewarding the righteous, by punishing the wicked. However, how can we understand the nature of divine justice? Does it always necessarily reflect just retribution? For instance, as I mentioned in Sefer Iyov, at the beginning of Sefer Iyov, in the introduction in Parak Aleph, Iyov is described as Tov Yishav Yirei Elohim V'Sor Me'Ra. He is upright, he's wholehearted, he feared God, he shunned evil, yet all sorts of afflictions befall him, seemingly undeserved. And the fourth set of episodes that I raised, the fourth example that I raised, is the many instances of lying and deception throughout Tanakh. What is the Tanakh trying to teach us regarding the ethics of lying and deception, both when God seems to deceive humanity and also when humans deceive one another? Is deception ethical in certain circumstances? For instance, is it ethical if we deceive in order to do a mitzvah? Is it ethical if we deceive in order to save somebody's life? Now, despite the Tanakh's prohibition against lying, we see that there are many, many instances throughout biblical narrative in which deceptive means are used to achieve a particular desired end. In biblical scholarship, they talk about the sister-wife narratives. There's 3 different instances in Tanakh, in Breshit, where one of the Avot, Avraham and then Yitzchak, lie to a foreign ruler by calling their wives their sisters in order to save themselves from a foreign ruler, from Paro and then from Avimelech. We see first 2 episodes where Avram, then Avraham do this with Sarah, first to Paro and then Avimelech, and then we see Yitzchak emulating the same idea later with Avimelech. We see Shimon v'Levi with the Chivim after Shechem violates their sister Dinah. Similarly, the Tanakh uses the word mirma with deception. They similarly act with deception by making a brit with them with no intention of fulfilling that brit, and then ultimately they ambush the Chivim and decimate the nation. Similarly, we have the stories of the Mialdot, the midwives, in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, and also Rachav, the foreign prostitute at the beginning of Sefer Yehoshua. They both use trickery. The 3 of them use trickery against Bnei Israel's enemy to preserve Bnei Israel's safety. We see probably the most blatant episode of deception in Tanakh and Breshit, where Rivka facilitates Yaakov's deception of Yitzchak by orchestrating this whole disguise, this whole plan in which Yaakov pretends to be Esav in order to receive the blessing of the firstborn in Breshit Perek Kaf Zayin. We see again later in Breshit Tamar deceiving Yehuda, seducing him in the guise of a prostitute, and when he refuses to allow her to marry his 3rd son, who he promised her after the death of his 2 older sons, who she was married. And not only does the Tanakh not condemn lying in all of these circumstances, God even encourages and perhaps commands Moshe and Bnei Israel to stretch the truth in Egypt in the beginning of Shemot. And also he instructs Shmuel to lie when the prophet expresses fear of danger from King Shaul in Sefer Shmuel, Perek Tet Zayin. Now, ancient, rabbinic, and medieval exegetical sources, as well as modern biblical and philosophical scholarship, they've advanced multiple interpretations regarding all of these episodes, often presenting very conflicting positions regarding the ethical nature of biblical characters' motivations and actions. For instance, with divine command morality that we talked about with the Akedah narrative, the problem of divine command ethics can be traced all the way back to ancient philosophy, to the famous dilemma posed by Socrates in the Euthyphro, where essentially Socrates asks whether the holy is beloved by the god because it is holy, or is holy because it is beloved of the gods. And many resources with regard to interpreting Akedat Yitzchak have praised Avraham for suspending his moral conscience in order to heed God's commands. Soren Kierkegaard, a famous Danish philosopher, is probably one of the most famous to take this approach. He praises Avraham as a knight of faith for engaging in what he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. Avraham suspended his ethics for the sake of a higher telos, namely to fulfill God's command. Others, however, have criticized Avraham for not relying on his ethical conscience when religion seemed to conflict with morality. Famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant is well known for that approach. While others, and many contemporary Jewish philosophers, respond in this way, they offer more of a reconciliatory approach in which the lesson of the Akedah is not really about the divine command and trying to understand that from a moral perspective, but the morality that is to be understood from the Akedah really is focused upon God stopping Abraham from carrying out the Akedah. And by stopping Abraham, the contemporary Jewish moral philosophers understand that through the Akedah, God is teaching Abraham about the nature of moral responsibility in divine worship. Namely, don't think, Abraham, that you should perpetuate the immoral pagan practices of your culture. From now on, you need to worship God in a more moral and a more refined manner. Now, similarly, the imperative for the internal annihilation of Amalek, that also has been interpreted in multiple ways. And the inherent moral challenge of commanding the murder of future innocent Amaleki descendants has motivated a lot of less literal and more metaphorical or halachic approaches. It can be deduced from the Talmudic interpretation in Kohelet, be not overly wicked, that while war against the innocent is not to be condoned, and doubts about the ethical nature of such attacks are appropriate, there are cases in which these doubts must be set aside. And since the Talmud does not explicitly articulate the reason to be not overly righteous, the imperative for the total annihilation of Amalek can be perceived as moral, due merely to its divine source if God determines morality. Alternatively, rather than interpreting God's charge literally, Amalek's act and punishment can be understood metaphorically as reflecting a struggle between good, represented by Bnei Israel, and evil, embodied by Amalek. So God's decree to defeat Amalek, and this being an eternal decree, really symbolizes the call for the domination of good over evil for all time. And additionally, halachics argue that the obligation to destroy Amalek could not be enforced due to the commingling of the nations, as it's no longer clear who the Amalek nation actually is as a result of Ashur's king Sancheriv's population transfers. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most challenging of all moral philosophical problems is the existence of evil and how it can be reconciled with an omnibenevolent and all-good God, and certainly a moral God, a fair God, a just God. And the suffering of the righteous, as depicted in Sefer Yov, has and continues to be the subject of varied interpretations among rabbinic, exegetical, and philosophical commentators. And while some attribute the divine afflictions imposed upon innocent Yov to the will of the Creator, and that will of God transcends human comprehensibility, our limited human understanding cannot fathom. There's no way for us to understand how God acts justly and how he rewards or how he punishes. Other commentators have blamed Iyov with various deficiencies in order to preserve the nature of divine just retribution. For instance, Rambam is one of the most famous to take this approach. Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, in Book 3, says, yes, according to the text, Iyov certainly was. Tov yeshav Elohim v'sor meira. Yes, he certainly was blameless in his action, but he was deficient in his wisdom. And therefore, because of his intellectual limitations or his lack of intellectual perfection, he did not warrant, he did not deserve God's divine providence. Now finally, though the Tanakh prohibits lying in many references to both judicial and non-judicial contexts, we have many, many instances, including in the Aseret HaDibrot, Lo tarecha ed shaker, we can't bear false witness. Midvar sheker tirchak, we need to distance ourselves from falsehood. Now, despite all of those clear psukim throughout Tanakh that describe the prohibition of lying, we see many, many instances in biblical narrative in which characters employ all different types of deceptive means, sometimes seemingly of an outright nature, but often in the more subtle use of misleading truth, saying something that is technically true, but intended to mislead. And they do this in many of these instances to achieve some clear desired end. And often these are not condemned, and in some instances they're even praised. Now, even though exegetes have criticized Abraham and Yitzchak for identifying their wives as their sisters to mislead these foreign rulers, other approaches have exonerated Abraham and Yitzchak because they argue that they seemingly just did what they felt was necessary in order to save their own lives. And similarly, some commentators objected to Shimon and Levi's use of what they see as disproportionate retaliation against Shechem and against the Chivim for Shechem's violation of their sister, because Shimon and Levi annihilated the entire nation. However, other commentators defend the brothers' acts as being necessary in order to rescue their sister from Shechem's hold. The Mialdot, the midwives of Bnei Israel in Egypt, and Rachav, a foreign prostitute at the beginning of Sefer Yoshua, are not praised explicitly for their use of trickery against Bnei Israel's enemy, though they are rewarded with protection for preserving Bnei Israel's safety. Similarly, we see that Tamar was considered righteous by Yehuda. Yehuda praises her as Sidka mimeni, right? She's more righteous than me, for perpetuating his legacy when he neglects to marry her off to his third son, to Shelah, who he had promised her after the death of her two oldest sons. However, specifically the deceptive means with which she uses when she pretends to be a prostitute in order to seduce him, that is not explicitly praiseworthy in the text. And some biblical scholars criticize Yaakov for his deception of his father in order to get the bracha. And these commentators argue that he was blameworthy and therefore suffered just consequences for his action. And they see these just consequences by being repaid for the deception by being deceived himself later in his life. For instance, when he goes down to Lavan's house and he works to marry Rachel, and then Lavan deceives him by marrying him to Leah instead. Later, after the Mechira, after his sons sell his other son Yosef, they bring back the bloodied Ketonet Pasim and deceive him into thinking that their son is dead. So we see some commentators explaining that Yaakov was wrong for having done that and therefore was justly punished for it. However, other commentators justify Yaakov and even praise him because they felt that his deception of his father was more of a selfless act. He was willing to sacrifice his life to a certain extent because he was banished. His mother sent him off to live with his uncle because he feared that Esav would kill him. And his deception really served as a selfless act for the benefit of the future generations of Bnei Israel, since Yitzchak had misperceived Esav's worthiness to receive the bracha. And therefore, Yaakov had to kind of sacrifice himself in order to make sure that Yitzchak did not give the bracha to the wrong brother. Now, the Tanakh does not condemn lying in such circumstances. And God, in certain situations, encourages, or some might even argue, commands lying. God instructs Moshe to ask Paro to let Bnei Israel go for a 3-day journey to worship. And later he tells Bnei Israel, using the term vishalu, that they should borrow the gold and the silver and the garments from the Mitzrim, when he knew that they had no intention of returning after those 3 days, and certainly no intention of returning those things to the Egyptian owners. Along similar lines, God tells Shmuel to deceive Shaul. When Shmuel expresses his fear, God tells Shmuel to anoint David in Shaul's stead. Shmuel is very scared that if Shaul knows, he will kill him. And God just says, well, you're just sacrificing. You don't have to let him know that it's part of this whole anointment process for the new king, David. Now, even though commentators assert that the language in many of these instances, most famously in the instance of the bracha with Yaakov, in many of these instances, we can interpret the language as literally true, even though it has a clear intention to mislead. These biblical episodes still raise ethical questions regarding whether there's a difference between an outright lie and a misleading truth, because they often result in the same consequences. So in famous commentaries with regard to the bracha with Yaakov deceiving his father, there's famous Rashi, for instance, will say that technically what Yaakov said was true, he just didn't say the whole truth. And therefore, even though he was technically saying what was true, that can exonerate him. However, from an ethical perspective, is a misleading truth so different than an overt lie? If you have the same intention to mislead, and if the consequences are the same, namely, the listener is in fact deceived. Now, since the Tanakh illustrates moral questions, but does not clearly dictate unequivocal dogmas, students need to interpret these ambiguities in an effort to find meaning in the biblical text that can then inform their own moral thinking. Now, these diverse readings demonstrate the complexity of the narratives and the multiple perspectives from which the narratives can be analyzed. The student gains a sense of the competing values, the competing motivations, the competing factors that are embedded inherently in moral conflict, both in those that are described in Tanakh and also in those that we encounter on a daily basis in our moral lives. Now, examination of the conduct of the biblical figures and the inner tensions that they feel, that motivates their actions, that can not only contribute to a deeper understanding of these ambiguous and challenging narratives in Tanakh, but it can also heighten students' moral reflection when they face their own ethical debates. Now, drawing upon biblical lessons, students can then similarly examine moral conflicts, because there's not one overarching lesson that emerges from Tanakh, and there's not one overarching rule that we can apply to all moral scenarios in our own lives. But drawing upon these lessons, students can then similarly use these tools and examine moral conflicts from the multiple perspectives, from the conflicting tensions that they face in contemporary life, and hopefully with a sensitivity to these competing values and a commitment to the importance of ethics that is clear from Tanakh.
Good morning. We've learned a lot this morning. I've been very fascinated by both of the presentations. Enjoyed very much Dr. Weiss and Rabbi Jaffe. I learned quite a lot this morning, and I've been thinking in my mind, what are the best things to focus on when we started speaking here? And I think I'll try to just share with you some thoughts, especially building on the wonderful insights that we've already heard, to talk about some of the benefits and challenges of trying to teach in this area. Why is it indeed so hard? Why do we sometimes, or perhaps too frequently, find that these gaps exist between what seem to be religious values and, on the other hand, behaviors that seem to be greatly out of sync? And on the other hand, what are some of the advantages in this area that maybe we can emphasize more, which might help a little bit? So I'll just try to share some thoughts. There's a lot to say. I don't want to take your time too much. And maybe we'll allow questions in the middle in case it'll help dictate the path of where we go with it. So I think it's important to appreciate that if we identify ethics with what we call mitzvos bein adam l'chavero, what we call the interpersonal commandments, it's not so obvious that those are the exact same, that one could use definitions that may differentiate between the two, but for convenience at least, and at least as an opening step, let's assume that those are roughly synonymous categories. So when we try to figure out how to convey the importance and the practical implications of interpersonal halacha, so there are some ways in which we have an easier time and some ways in which we have a more challenging time, and perhaps appreciating those helps. So first of all, it's certainly important to appreciate that mitzvos bein adam l'chavero, our interpersonal commandments, are certainly equally important to the rest of the Torah. I think there is abundant proof that that is the case, abundant sources we can look to. We just read 2 weeks ago about the Aseres HaDibros, about the 10 Commandments, so to speak, and we know that the Rishonim understand that there are two equal tablets of importance that is comparable, and they're meant to be taken together. And Rashi and others emphasize the theme as we go into the next week's Parsha, in Parshas Mishpatim, which focuses more explicitly on civil relationships. And at the very beginning of the Parsha, it's re-emphasized to us how this is equally from Sinai, just as the rest of the Torah is, and how all of that has to be seen as one unbreakable unit. And there are abundant proofs, we could spend the whole day pointing to them, that certainly when it comes to this part of the Torah, it's not meant to be taken as any less important than the rest of the Torah, certainly not. And the truth is, we can also find indications that in some ways it is more important, or at least more demanding upon us. The realm of interpersonal halacha seems to actually ask of us things that may be greater, may be more demanding than the mitzvos ben adam lamakom, than the obligations that we have directly to God. And some of the Rishonim actually do have the language saying that it's actually more important, but in certain specific ways, it simply asks us to do more. So one example that we find is that there is a greater emphasis on understanding the concepts, on looking at the theory and realizing that here is an opportunity to understand God in a way that doesn't necessarily exist in the rest of the Torah. There's a story that's related in the introduction to one sefer that someone came to the Chafetz Chaim and he said he's interested in buying all of his many books, with one exception: he doesn't want to buy Chafetz Chaim. So Chafetz Chaim, his work on the laws of improper speech, of Lashon Hara, that one he's not interested in buying. And the Chafetz Chaim is a little offended. It's the one he's named after. So he says, why is it that you only want to buy all the other Sfarim and not this one? So the man said, listen, you wrote the Mishnah Brura, it's about the laws of Shabbos and the laws of davening. I think I can manage to live up to that. You wrote about the sacrifices, it's not going to affect my life so much. You wrote about how we shouldn't speak badly about people. I'm a businessman, I'm out there in a dog-eat-dog world of business. There's no way I am going to be able to live up to the requirements of this book. And the Chafetz Chaim, perhaps not surprisingly, didn't buy that argument, and he said, I think you should take this one too. And he quoted Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who we heard about before. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter had said that this book is worth it if all it accomplishes, if the only thing that you're able to do with the publication of this book is that one Jew reads it and what? So you might say if one Jew reads it and changes his behavior, it's worth it. But the actual quote apparently was, it's worth it if one Jew reads it and sighs. What do you mean he sighs? It means he says, oh wow, if only I could fulfill everything that's in this work. But I can't. Okay, moving on. That'd be worth it. And why is that worth it? Because normally we assume that we do want to change behavior, and if we don't change behavior, the Talmud actually says sometimes we're better off not knowing. We're better off being inadvertent sinners than knowing sinners. We're better off not knowing about commandments that we're not going to fulfill. So why is the Chafetz Chaim apparently deviating from this principle in saying, read my book even if you're not going to follow the rules? And I thought perhaps it's based on a comment of the Rambam. The Rambam in his introduction to Pirkei Avos makes a distinction, which to go into all the details would take us a longer time, but essentially he posits that the chukim, what we call the statutes, the mitzvos that we don't really understand, and the mishpatim, on the other hand, the principles that we have some kind of intellectual access to. Sometimes they're termed mitzvos sichlios, in that sense, the mitzvos that we have some kind of intellectual appreciation, as opposed to what's often called the mitzvos shimios, the mitzvos that we obey, but we don't necessarily understand. The Rambam says there's a practical difference in terms of how we relate to them. That when it comes to the chukim, so we are asked to observe them, and if we don't understand and we don't connect to it intellectually or emotionally, that's fine. We can live 120 years, say, I don't understand why I'm not supposed to eat cheeseburgers. They look very appealing. I walk past McDonald's, I see 2 burgers, fries, a Coke, and a free apartment for 98 cents. That's very tempting. But fine, God asked me not to. That's all I'm going to do. And if that's your whole life, we don't care. It doesn't matter that you never lose your interest in the cheeseburgers. But when it comes to the principles that we can relate to, so the Rambam writes, there's a whole different approach. That even though maybe you might start off not necessarily appreciating what they're about, but we are asking you to mold your personality in this way. That might be a lifelong effort, that may not be automatic, but there is a goal, and it's not to be put in the same category as the cheeseburgers. It's fine for you to live 120 years and say, I don't get this, I really want to have cheeseburgers, but I'll just stay away anyway. But when it comes to hurting people, when it comes to stealing, when it comes to all these ideas that we have some kind of appreciation for, so then we are supposed to think differently about them, and it takes a different approach, and perhaps that's what the Chafetz Chaim is getting at. So you don't want to read my Mishnah Berurah, I'd be okay with that. If you didn't think you would follow the rules in the Mishnah Berurah, so fine, maybe you're better off not knowing. But these principles, which you might not practice in your life, but hopefully you'll be able to understand where they're getting at, you'll be able to see what we're trying to create with these principles, it's worth your reading even if you don't think it's actually going to make a difference in the end of the day. Of course, parentheses, he probably thought it would ultimately make a difference, but it sounds like he's saying that even without that, there is a value here that is worth pursuing. So from that perspective, we find that these mitzvos are more demanding, that they ask of us not only to follow the rules, but to relate to the concept in a way that we don't necessarily find with the rest of the Torah. On the other hand, there is a kind of inverse but compensating stringency that you find also, that when it comes to the interpersonal commandments, there is kind of an opposite stringency, which offsets this one, which comes from the other side of the equation. There is a statement in the Talmud, which Reb Chaim Shmulevitz made a very important comment on, that it has an actual reflection throughout halacha. The Talmud talks about the two wives, that Chana and Penina were married to the same man, and Chana at that time should ultimately be the mother of Shmuel, but at that time she didn't have any children. And Penina, the other wife, had many children. And the Navi tells us that Penina actually would taunt Chana, which is obviously unbelievably cruel. And yet the Talmud has the statement that Penina l'shem shamayim niskavna, that Penina meant well. She had some kind of a plan here that if she would make Chana miserable enough, she'd daven harder, and somehow it would be in her interest. So Chaim Shmulevitz posed the question, are we trying to say here, is the Talmud actually telling us that Penina was such a villain in the Psukim, that Penina should be defended, that Penina did the right thing? And he explained, no, it's just the opposite. The Talmud is telling us it doesn't matter, that the fact that she may have had good intentions doesn't justify what she did, and indeed we see from the Psukim she's punished terribly. And the Talmud is making the point that it doesn't matter that she may have had some kind of a justification in her mind for what she was doing. So apparently there's a principle here which he expresses in his Musar discourses, and you can find it really in earlier generations throughout the Achronim and Halachic manifestations, that when you're dealing with human beings, there's a different standard in terms of making sure you actually get the right results. That we have a concept that God forgives our mistakes, so to speak, when we are put in a position where we don't have any other choice. Ones, Rachmana Patre, that God will forgive us when we can't do any better. So they explain that that's true because God knows what you're trying to do. God can appreciate your intentions, so he can credit you for your efforts. But human beings are not able to credit you for your efforts. Human beings have emotions and needs that are real, and they can't just forget about. So if you're going to hurt someone, the fact that maybe you meant well is not going to mitigate the pain. Or if someone is in desperate need of your assistance and you have a very good excuse why you have to be somewhere else, it's not going to help them. They're still going to suffer for the lack of assistance. So therefore you find, as Reb Chaim Shmulevitz explains in that lecture, and you find it throughout in earlier Sfarim as well, that perhaps there has to be a greater priority in getting results when it comes to interpersonal halacha, because God can understand what you're getting at, but your friend who is in need doesn't have that ability, or your friend who has emotions that are going to be hurt cannot just say, I know that you meant well. And therefore, conversely, the same time as we put a greater emphasis on concept, we also have to put a greater emphasis on practice, a greater emphasis on results, that there's a stringency coming from two directions when it comes to interpersonal halacha. So we start off with, on the one hand, equal importance. The two halves of the Torah are parallel and have the same weight. But at the same time, interpersonal halacha actually has some greater weight, a greater focus on concept, which is important and which you find throughout. We find the argument often advanced in the earlier generations, later generations, that it's a unique opportunity to relate to Torah. And Rabbeinu Yonah writes in his commentary to the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, where we're told, Havim Misunim B'din. We normally translate that to mean that in matters of din, in matters of justice, we should be thoughtful and careful and deliberate. Rabbeinu Yonah has a whole exposition there where he notes that these principles of din, of interpersonal interaction, give us a unique opportunity to understand God's plan for the world and His wisdom as it plays out in real life. And therefore, if you want to have access in a way that you don't normally have, heavy misunim bedin, think carefully about this area of halacha because it gives us insights that we can't get elsewhere. So we have a greater importance from the perspective of concept, but we also have a greater emphasis on the practice and making sure that the results are the results that we need to see. And all of that should lead to an increased level of accomplishment when it comes to interpersonal halacha. And yet we know that it doesn't always play out. And yet we know that, as we heard a few times this morning, that we see often gaps, we see often great disparities between what we see in the Sfarim, what we see as prescribed halacha, and what we see carried out. And we think about this all the time. I think all of us think about this all the time. Why do you find such gaps? And I think there are a few approaches that together contribute. And every question has a different answer. Every example has a different reason. It's all part of a patchwork. But I think there are a few things that we can highlight that can perhaps be at least a part of how we think about the questions and contribute a little bit to how we address the questions. So first of all, there's a little bit of an example bias here. The fact is that all of us are inconsistent in all areas. All of us are better at some things than at other things, and we're better at the same things yesterday than we are tomorrow. And that there are inconsistencies all the time, and it doesn't always really break down into these categories that it sometimes seems like, that we're better at mitzvos ben adam l'makom than we are at mitzvos ben adam l'chaveiro. It's not necessarily the way that it breaks down, even though it may feel like it, because the examples might be more blatant or might be more obvious. So the fact that we have strengths and weaknesses and that all of us have ups and downs and inconsistencies, and even within the same example, even with the same kind of behavior, we were good on Monday and we're bad on Tuesday, we're good in this case and we're weaker in the other case. So I think that's true of all of us. So that's just a part of human nature, that there are times when we are stronger and times when we are weaker, and that affects how things play out. That being said, if one should assume that we do see some kind of pattern, that maybe we are better at the mitzvos ben adam l'makom than we are at the mitzvos ben adam l'chaveiro, that somehow if you could assess that it is consistently the case that we are stronger with the interpersonal ritual commandments than we are with the mitzvos that are between man and God and ritual than we are with the interpersonal, more understandable commandments. So there could be some explanations for that as well. So one is that we tend to be better at things that are easier and have a harder time with things that are more difficult. And the fact is, very often it is the case that interpersonal obligations are more demanding. They are more difficult. They ask for a greater sacrifice. They ask for a life that requires more sensitivity and more concern and more imposition on our own personal interests very often. It depends on where you're coming from and what exactly your life circumstances are, but very often that is the case, that there is a greater burden, a greater responsibility that comes with this set of obligations. And so mathematically, that could contribute to the explanation as well. It's simply harder to live a life where you're always properly sensitive to the needs of others and properly honest and properly living up to all of the many demands of that half of the Torah than it is sometimes to keep Shabbos and to keep kosher. Very often that's the case. Obviously, that's not to downplay the difficulties that can come up in the areas of Shabbos and kashrus as well, but it's just often the case that it's simply a more challenging environment. But contributing to that is also the fact that it often comes across more subjectively. There are often more complex decisions that have to be made. It's often less clear-cut. There are, as we heard discussed so beautifully in terms of some of the stories in Tanakh, there are very often conflicting values and situations that lend one to come to complex decisions, and that already makes it harder. It's a different level of difficulty, that it's not just that it's difficult to live up to, sometimes it's more difficult to figure out what the right approach is. And then those two also combine, because once it's already harder to live up to your obligations to others, and there's room to wonder, well, am I really obligated in this, or is it not, or is this an exception, or I have another type of situation that I have competing. So then those two come together to say, okay, so it's already a big demand to do this on behalf of someone else, and I'm not really sure that I really have to. I can make the case that I have other priorities. So together those can combine and leave us with a justification that, okay, I don't have to actually live up to that standard in this case, or that's not the standard in itself. That's something that I can convince myself is perhaps the case. So that's an area where I think we have to pay a lot of attention to, because the subjectivity especially is inherent in the nature, it's inherent in what is involved in dealing with people, but that doesn't allow us to run away from it. It's something that I think we have to really confront in a very serious way, and to consider how that impacts us. And one of my more recent books was about Lashon Hara. And Lashon Hara is an area where it's a good example of this kind of dynamic, that you see this a lot, that when it comes to Lashon Hara, so we have essentially two competing values. That on the one hand, we have this prohibition in the Torah not to speak badly about people, and on the other hand, we know that we also have to be on the lookout to protect the needs of those who are innocent and those who might be victimized, those who might be hurt by someone else. And in the same verse in the Torah, we're told, Lo samur al dam re'echa, that we can't stand idly by when somebody is at risk, and we have to stand up and do something. So it's really two halves of the same verse in the Torah, showing us that we have a constant tension. On the one hand, Lo say lech rachel, don't speak badly about others. On the other hand, don't let people be hurt unnecessarily. So we're constantly trying to balance the tension between the two. So that creates a reality where one can hide behind either half. One can theoretically say, okay, well, I have to say this because I think it's necessary to protect the innocent or improve society or whatever it is, so I have to say something negative, and one may not be fully justified as much as they think. Or one can also take the opposite approach and say, well, I'm being so religious, I'm observing the prohibition of Lashon Hara, and I'm being careful not to say anything. That's where I have to give my allegiance. So the fact that one could cover themselves with either half doesn't change the reality that ultimately we are accountable for our judgment calls, that a part of being a quality person is determining what is the right call between these two opposing values. And I think part of why there has been such a focus on the laws of Lashon Hara ever since the Chafetz Chaim wrote his Sefer the past 150 years is because it is a particularly challenging and complicated area, and it takes a lifetime to hone the sensitivity so that your judgment calls really reflect the balance of the two values. So it's true in this area, but it's true in every area. It's true that we're constantly trying to come to an honest assessment of what life really asks of us, and that's sometimes more complicated than the other areas of Torah, and a question in the laws of Shabbos, a question in the laws of Kashrus, which are plenty complicated, as we know, but here the complexities can be different, and therefore that gives us sometimes room to hide. But ultimately what it really asks of us, and why the Torah continuously repeats in the context specifically of these kind of questions, we're constantly reminded that God is watching. And Rashi explains in many of those places that when the Torah emphasizes that God is watching, it's specifically because of these kinds of challenges where it's possible to say, well, I'm doing the right thing because I'm hiding behind this justification or the other. And they don't mean overtly. I mean just in terms of convincing ourselves that this is the right path. So therefore, all the more so, there's a greater emphasis on trying to come to a conclusion that is just, and it's not easy. It's a hard process, and I think that's a part of why we find some of the challenges. It's not going to answer everything, because we all know that there are lapses in interpersonal behavior that we can point to that no one could ever justify, that doesn't even enter into such a discussion. And like I said before, all of the questions have different answers. Every example has a different mixture of factors that contribute to it, but I think that's a part of it, and therefore emphasizing some of the previous points that we mentioned, just how important it is to get to the right results, just how important it is to study these topics with an eye towards what is the underlying concept. All of those come together in order to create the different parts of the puzzle so that we hope that we can come to the right decisions. And I think it's also important to focus on what are the parts of the equation, even when we come to one conclusion, what's on the other side of the equation. And that's one thing that's it's very relevant to what Dr. Weiss spoke about, just to maybe use one example. So the question, let's say, for example, of Yaakov's choice to listen to his mother and to be involved in what seems to be deceptive behavior with Yitzchak. So Dr. Weiss pointed out that there is a strain that we find in the commentaries based on Chazal, that Yaakov did not really say anything overtly false, that his words could be parsed to be technically accurate. And of course it poses the question, okay, so does that really excuse him of dishonesty? Would that be an acceptable way of communicating if you're doing business with somebody and you're going to phrase your words in a way that the words are technically correct but clearly misleading? So would anyone say that that's legitimate behavior? So I would say of course not, and I don't think that that's actually the message of Chazal there. And there are other statements that you find that make this point also, that clearly what Yaakov was saying was misleading. So the question is, what is the benefit of phrasing his words in such a way that it could be interpreted as technically true? If the impact is misleading, how does that help us at all? So what it seems to be, and this is something that many of the Bali Musar pointed out, remember Rosh Shiva of Goldvich, Zechron Levracha, has an essay where he makes this point as well, that Yaakov perceived that he is in a compromised situation here, that he's saying something which is misleading, and even if we can assume that it's justified, which is a whole different discussion, but let's work under the assumption that it was justified and necessary to be misleading, but Yaakov perceived here that, okay, maybe that's what I have to do, but what about my soul? What about my character that has to remain committed to honesty and that has to live after this and continue to transmit to future generations the importance of integrity and honesty. So therefore, I have to do whatever I can to offset this. So yes, this is the decision that has to be made for today, but what can I do to preserve my attitude that honesty is crucial and that there has to be a commitment to integrity in all things, and how can I make sure that I'm not taking the mindset, okay, this is something that I had to do for today and I don't have to worry any further about the impact that it has on me. So that's an important consideration that enters into the equation, and I think it's part of the value of what Dr. Weiss was talking about in terms of how we teach the students in struggling with these texts, that they should understand that there's a trade-off in these cases, and that even when we can decide that the result is justified, but the trade-off should not be ignored because it impacts on how we think about everything else, and whatever can be done to mitigate the effects of the trade-off are important because it affects all the other decisions that we make after that. So all of that is important, and I think these are just parts of the puzzle, that just understanding that within interpersonal halacha there are some ways in which we have greater access to the process, some ways in which what we teach will resonate more effectively, and you can use that to create an educational system that will have a greater impact. But there are some inherent challenges as well, and the challenges are built in just to the reality of what we're dealing with and what can be done to offset the challenges. And there's a lot more to say about this, but maybe I'll leave some room for questions. Maybe I'll just say a little bit of a little bit based on the point that Dr. Jaffe mentioned. I was very fascinated by his whole discussion about how to, Rabbi Jaffe mentioned about how he created this program to narrow the gap between the mind and the heart, and we know that that's clearly a big part of it also. And sometimes it simply is that there is a disconnect separate from everything that we've spoken about, and that we know that there is a value, but we don't actually feel it, we don't actually connect it. And he made reference to the debate around the Musar movement and about how those who opposed the Musar movement they said that that's for sick people. If I remember, he mentioned that idea that not everyone needs that kind of a training. So the reference, if I remember correctly, is to a debate that actually centered around the Talmudic text. If I remember correctly, I think it is related in Rav Soloveitchik's work in Halachic Man. I think he relates the story about one of the arguments that took place around the Musar movement, because there was some very intense approaches, as we also heard about the Navardic approach, which is a very negative and think about you're going to die soon kind of approach. And part of that has to do with a text in the Talmud. The Gemara says in Masechus Brachos on Daf Hey, the Gemara talks about how one should always fight the Yetzer Hara, and one should always try to combat whatever evil inclinations he has. And the Talmud goes on to say there are different methods that one should learn Torah, that's effective. And if that doesn't work, he should say Kriya Shema and think about that. And if that doesn't work, he should think about that he's going to die someday. He should remember the day of death, and that will have an impact. So this text became a part of the whole debate as to the proper approaches. So those who were advocating on behalf of the Musar movement, and particularly this more intense form of it, I think it was Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer, a prominent student of Rabbi Shmuel Salanter, who was making this argument, that you see in the progression in the Talmud that this seems to be the most effective. It's the last thing on the list. Remember the day of death. This seems to be the most effective, so that's what we're going for. We're going for the most effective tool. And the response was, perhaps it was Reb Chaim Brisker who was the one who was responding, was that no, that like we heard before, that's for sick people, that the Talmud is telling you 3 stages in order to say that you don't necessarily go right to surgery, and if you want to promote good health, there are other ways that are less invasive to keep people healthy, and it's only when somebody's really sick, so then we go to the most extreme method and we operate. But it doesn't mean that that's always what's recommended for everyone. So what I don't know if anyone's pointed out is that it's essentially perhaps part of the text, that this whole passage in the Gemara, which gives the 3 stages, so it quotes a pasuk. It says, how do we know this idea? Because the pasuk says, "Rigzu v'al techto," that we should fight and you shouldn't sin. You should fight against the inclination to sin. And then the pasuk goes on, "Imru al levavchem al mitaschem v'dom musala," that you should imru, you should say the words of Torah. So that's how we know that you should fight it through Torah study. And then al mitaschem, on your bed. So that's the reference to Kriya Shema, which we say at night. And then the last part was v'dom musala. You think about death. You think about the ultimate silence. So that's the final stage. That's where the Talmud points to all the phrases in the pasuk to say these are different tools that we can use to fight the Yetzer Hara. So if you think about the whole question of whether that first step works, whether that idea of just Torah study should be effective, and that's what they were arguing in Volozhin, that for us, the Torah study is enough. We don't have to shoot right to the more extreme methods, but it's perhaps instructive that the language of the verse is Imru b'levavchem, that you should say this to your hearts, and that's itself a whole discussion what the implications are, but perhaps it already suggests that there are different kinds of reactions. There are people who study and it speaks to their hearts. There are people who feel the emotional impact of what these words are, and it therefore creates an effect on their soul. And there are people who don't necessarily feel it, who can read a text and it doesn't necessarily have any emotional impact. So then we have to figure out how can we increase that emotional impact, how can we make the effects and the implications more real. And that's perhaps what the Talmud is telling us. It's going to depend on who we're talking to. And I see this sometimes in the literature, that sometimes those who really, it seems a little bit like there's 2 contradictory attitudes, but sometimes we think that if somebody is very technical halachic, so then they have a harder time relating to some of the more complex questions which involve other kinds of issues. But what I've seen, perhaps recently, a little bit to my surprise, and I'm coming to appreciate it, that sometimes you find that those who are more technical halachic, sometimes that also results that the Ben Adam L'Chaveiro questions are also a part of that package, that they also take those more seriously than you would expect, because they have a integrated view of how halacha is binding and how God's word is binding, and it actually does end up impacting both sides of the equation. So there are many different personalities out there, and there are many different ways to reach those personalities, and I think we have to have all of these tools in our arsenal and to recognize that this is an ongoing battle for all of us. It's not something which we're born good at, and it takes, and we're all going to constantly stumble along the path, but try to commit to all of these different tools as different ways to bring about that kind of an integrated personality. I hope that that can at least have an effect on ourselves, and who knows, perhaps also overflow a little bit into those around us.